Hi all, welcome to week 12. It's been a little while. Hopefully everybody enjoyed the Ohlone Way and their week off for spring break. I know I did. I got back from Vietnam on Sunday night and had a great cultural experience over in that country. For week 12, we're going to be focused on the native peoples of the plains, quite a fascinating group with a lot of diversity. Here you're looking at a picture of where the plains actually stretches. And the plains is composed of a couple different kind of geographical regions. You kind of have the tall grass up in Montana with the big mountains. At least the kind of land, the plains were right up against the mountains. And then you go all the way down into kind of what we would call the prairie. What does bring this group together is the grasslands and the bison, which lead to a lot of the hunts and subsistence strategies. Okay, so here's a picture of a bison. Again, we call them buffalo. It's the wrong word. This is an example of the bison. The bison are really the animal that went out in terms of the Ice Age when we had kind of mammoths and those big, massive mammals coming over, where you had not only mammoths but woolly rhinos and the saber-toothed tigers and all of that stuff. And humans, in terms of the Bering Strait land bridge kind of crossing theory, came over following big game at about 20,000, maybe more than that. Again, aside from the Kelp Road theory. Came down and hunted. The bison really survive where these other big game animals do not, as the ice recedes. And it's because the prairie and the grasslands are kind of perfect areas for the bison to survive. It's said that there were up to about 60 million of them in 1800 AD. They are rapidly diminished after the Americans start to move west because they ultimately shoot them all off, kill them, let them rot, and replace that area with cattle grazing because this is the meat that Europeans preferred, and Americans obviously. Unfortunately, bison meat is actually healthier than cattle meat, but that's a whole nother nutritional story. Pronghorn antelope are also in this area, so if you ever go through Wyoming, I remember it was one of my kind of early childhood memories when we were headed to Yellowstone, kind of seeing pronghorn antelope in this area. Deer, elk, rabbits, wild turkey, sage grouse, quail. This is pretty much your animal meat protein source. And then roots and berries. Prickly pear cactus as you kind of go south where it gets a little warmer. And then in the prairies, they actually had agriculture. They had what we call, excuse me, they had what we call the Three Sisters, which is corn, beans, and squash. A lot of this is coming out of, obviously, Mesoamerica, because this is where these kind of agricultural products are being developed. And they are brought up a long time ago in this area. So this area has agriculture in the prairies, and this is usually along rivers, right? So streams, anything that had water. History. Earliest evidence of occupation is about 12,000 years ago. We get down into kind of the Clovis Point period. And when I put Central Valley here, it's really more valleys that are is where there are archaeological evidence of these people living. And in these valleys, we would have rivers. So this is kind of the oldest area. Bison take over at about 9,000 years ago. And again, like I said, the big mammals die off. 4,000 years ago, we have evidence of teepees being used. 1,000 years ago, we have the Athabascan people moving into this area, and they kind of make up different tribes in this area. So there's a blending and mixture of culture, and the Athabascan are coming down from Canada. 2,500 years ago, backing up a little bit, so 15 or 500 kind of BCE, we have corn and beans moving into the prairies. And again, a lot of times people ask, why aren't these kind of, if they could spread all over, why didn't they make it to these other places? And again, the answer is that they were not necessary, right? People settled in this area because they had agriculture and they made it kind of their home. But people like in California, they did not need to grow these things because food was basically jumping on their lap. European contact and ethnographic data. Spanish explorers, we had 1540s, we had De Soto cross into the southern plains. That's going to cause some major problems if you drop down kind of further on that slide. Smallpox wipes out a large portion of the groups here, and ultimately they don't really recover. So when they're kind of met up again in the 1690s by the Hudson Bay Company and traders, and then again the Americans come in with the Lewis Clark expedition, these groups are nothing like they were prior to that contact. Smallpox really does kind of diminish their numbers and wipes a lot of people out and creates a lot of conflict as well. So the Hudson Bay Company in the 1690s, they do come in and trade starts up. And again, the whole kind of fur trade, animal trade is coming up around this time period. Lewis and Clark, 1804, American explorers passed through. Fort Laramie Treaty in 1851, it basically, a lot of the native groups here signed this treaty in order to ensure that they have land rights and that the American government will not take the land from them. So in exchange, they basically allow for settlers safe passage through their land. And the settlers at the time are okay with passing through because they don't really want to settle in this area. The soil is very thick and hard to work in terms of agriculture, so they're not too keen on kind of living in this harsh land. Remember, really, really cold during the winter, really hot and muggy during the summer. If anybody's lived in this area, they definitely know. Big bugs, those kinds of things. Not necessarily your Mediterranean California climate. So ultimately, the natives who have lived there forever, this is their home, so they're not, deeply concerned about it. But a lot of people are moving west. And obviously, if you're looking at that 1851 number and people passing through, a lot of people are moving to California, Oregon, and those areas because, 1849, gold strikes. So ultimately, this area becomes very popular in terms of passing through settlers. Now, there's going to be some issues there. The natives tend to steal horses that come through or whatever, and there's going to be some retaliation. And there's little things that happen here and there. So the treaty is really something kind of to research into to see which groups were abiding by the treaty and which groups weren't, and then kind of the retaliation piece when something does go wrong or somebody's offended or not felt like they've been treated fairly. There's a Sioux War that ensues. Red Cloud, you've probably heard of Red Cloud. They basically are not part of the treaty. A lot of the Sioux are not. And in 1860, they ultimately do sign the Fort Laramie Treaty and create a Black Hills Reservation. Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull do not sign the treaty because they have to give up some of their land or break up part of their land in the reservation, and they're not okay with that. Gold is also discovered in this area in the Black Hills. This creates a lot of problems. Remember, whenever there's gold discovered, we tend to have major conflicts with the Native Americans. This happened in California, it happened in Colorado, and it also happens in the Dakotas. This is where we get the Battle of Little Bighorn, Custer's Last Stand, 1877. And I feel like in history, this was one of the most kind of discussed Native American plains conflict with American military or U.S. Army. So again, conflict with the U.S. military is another way that decimates a lot of these people. There are many massacres in this area. Sand Creek Massacre is the most kind of the big one that is talked about most in history. So yeah, the Plains natives have a really hard time not only with disease, but now they have kind of the U.S. military coming in and wiping them out. In terms of ethnographic data, George Catlin, really is there to kind of document things. He's more of a lot of artist, also ethnographic kind of data researcher. Robert Lowy, again, a disciple of Boaz and kind of the Berkeley, eventually into the Berkeley era. Ultimately, Lowy gets some museums named after him, but he's going to study these native groups. E. Adamson Hobel. E. Adamson Hobel is a fascinating character who pretty much lays down, after Malinowski, the groundwork for legal anthropology. And that is looking at law and legality from a native perspective or an indigenous perspective, arguing that every group has law to a certain degree. It might not be written down like our Constitution, but there are laws, and maybe they're enacted through social norms and protocols after those norms are broken. He has written some great books on things like primitive law, and he did some major studies with the Cheyenne and the Comanche around law, council, decision-making, those kinds of things. Fascinating character. He was up at the University of Minnesota, and he was also trained by Boaz as well. Fascinating legal anthropology kind of aspect, and now we start to really get a break off into legal anthropology as its own kind of separate subfield. And Hobel's kind of like the main guy that everybody looks to and builds upon in that area. Social political organization. These groups had different organizations. If you were north and you were in the plains, they were bands and tribes, and they were led by headmen. Remember, these are temporary leadership. And then further south, you kind of had more in the station, or when it was more permanent areas, and people who stayed longer or bigger groups. You had chiefs, you had war chiefs, which is separate, and then you had a council, and all of these people would make decisions. So a lot of times if there was a war or a conflict that came up, the war chief would basically take control of the tribe and decision making. So the chief, there was a balance of power there, and definitely separate organizations, and we'll talk about those in a second. Mostly men, but if the men were gone, then the big women, or the women with most prestige or leadership experience would take the lead. Let's see. Prairie groups lived in permanent towns, led by chiefs as well. So again, prairie groups have agriculture, and they are permanent, and they're going to be led by chiefs. So a lot of times, again, we can see a permanent structure of the way of life equals also political structure and even social structure to a certain degree, right? Again, as we kind of move through these groups, we get ranked societies and social stratification related to wealth, prestige, and in a lot of ways, individualism was prized in these areas. Now we have to think, why was individualism prized in these areas? Well, the horse creates a certain individualistic aspect of life here. You're now, if you ride on a horse or you own a horse, it's going to create wealth, it's going to create prestige, but it definitely creates an individuality, really. You're no longer just walking with the tribe like everybody else, okay? You are at a different pace. You could head off in your own direction. It creates a sense of individual being, to be honest. So the horse itself is not only has a material aspect to it, but there's a lot of symbolic enhancements to individualism out of this. Lineage, a lot of things are at least in terms of social structure in this area, are based on kinship. Okay, so that's also huge. Sharing and charity were also valued, so these were major components, even though there was an individual component. Sharing and charity were absolutely a valued structure in this society. They even have what was called the beggar's dance, where the poorer people would beg the wealthier to pass down kind of money or food products, basic needs stuff, in order to kind of survive. So this is just part of the alms to the poor and charity through this beggar's dance. Some of the other interesting facts here, again, you've seen two-spirits before. If men didn't want to go off to war, they could basically claim to be a two-spirit. And remember, two-spirit males could actually have sex with males or females, but took on more female roles. Sometimes females were also two-spirits, where they would take on male roles. So in terms of these gender kind of stratification or gender roles, they were pretty structured until you get into two genders, or two spirits, which makes it so that you can kind of do what you want. You could, as an individual, you can kind of choose which kind of gender roles you would like to pick. And again, this is coming out of this kind of gender spectrum, to be honest, where people are not just stuck to what they were born with as a biological sex. And again, two spirits in this area were revered. They were not put down. They were not a lower part of class or anything like that. They were just members of society. So they served a very important function. Again, it's kind of like one opting out of certain gender behaviors here in our culture today. So very fascinating.